Good evening, everybody. I'm going to get things started. Welcome to the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. My name is Claire Zimmerman, and I am Professor and Director of the PhD in Architecture, Landscape, and Design here at the Daniels Faculty. Thanks to all of you for attending tonight's public program series, on which I'll elaborate shortly. Before we proceed, I'm going to read our standard land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As many of you may know, the name of the avenue on which our faculty sits, Spadina, comes from the Anishinaabe and means a place on a hill. This site was also part of an important trail for several First Nations. As an institution committed to promoting truth and reconciliation, we honor these connections as we move forward collectively. And that's the end of the land acknowledgement, to which I would add that land acknowledgements don't necessarily signify substantive action on the part of any institution, but neither do they excuse inaction, although they may sometimes be used that way. Luckily, we are here to take some action tonight, and over the past few days, we have been doing just that. More on those activities in a moment. Our fall program series, which began in mid-September and concludes late next month, comprises an exciting lineup of lectures, book talks, exhibition openings, symposia, and more, many of them sponsored by the ALD PhD program and its faculty members, among whom I would single out Jason Wen for bringing us two wonderful speakers earlier in the semester. Our public programs encompass our range of disciplines and reflect our commitment to interdisciplinary study and practice. Next week, our Zeidler-Evans lecturer, Mia Barup-Tofta, will share with us the innovative work of Nord architects with a focus on their groundbreaking approach to designing for healthcare. And on November 13th, we will meet Rehousing, a design-forward nonprofit organization addressing housing challenges through applied research, consultation, and education. I hope you will join us for these talks and events. I'll also take this opportunity to let the audience know of a special event on Friday, that is tomorrow, here in this space at 5:30 p.m. The Council for Canadian Urbanism will give a presentation of the latest examples of good urban design from coast to coast in Pechakucha-style rapid-fire presentation. Leading urbanists will present best practices and award-winning projects from British Columbia, the Prairies, Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic, and Northern Canada. The event is free and open to all. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Professor Michael Mossman. I met Michael last year at the University of Sydney, where we first began to discuss a potential partnership between our two institutions with our colleague Andrew Leach, specifically on research relating to Indigenous architecture and environments, an area in which our faculty has been working to improve its commitments and the depths of its research. In Oceania, work advances on this topic as well, underscoring the fact of global trends in Indigenous architecture and culture. We are, with this visit of Michael and Andrew from Australia, planting a seed. We hope it will grow and prosper in both spaces, encouraging more Indigenous students to seek a career in built and natural environmental art and design. Welcome, then, to our current Indigenous students at the Daniels faculty. This research represents a uniquely apposite response, I would argue, to the juggernaut of global capitalism. The seeming paradox of global indigeneity that we have been discussing this week represents a powerful counterweight to hegemonies of capital and culture. But its implicit connections to sustainability, to multinaturalism, to new materialism, to computation and digital fabrication, to regionalism, and to futurism all need to be carefully fostered. In our own school, not only do all architecture students stand to benefit from investing further in this research area, but so do students in our other disciplines: landscape, visual studies, urban design, and forestry. It stands to reason that the long-standing knowledge of cultures able to sustain life on this planet for millennia are particularly important today as we face climate collapse and a shrinking planet. But let me now introduce our speaker. Dr. Michael Mossman is a Kuku-Yalanji man born and raised in Cairns on Yidinji country. He now lives and works on Gadigal land and is the Associate Dean of Indigenous Strategy and Services at the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning. Dr. Mossman is also a registered architect who champions country, the Australian term for Indigenous homelands, and I hope I have that right, and First Nations cultures as agents for structural change in the broader architectural profession at the levels of education, practice, and policy. His lecture tonight, or a Country Terror Refrain, explores First Nations cultural and philosophical concepts of lived experiences with place and architecture in Western-built environments. And I think I'm going to let him tell the rest of it and not read the rest of this paragraph. Dr. Mossman invites us to reflect on experiences of place and culture relative to our own ideas of home through this lecture. At the end of the presentation, I believe Michael will take audience questions, and I'll be happy to help moderate if that is helpful. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Mossman to the Daniels stage.
Thank you, Claire, for that wonderful introduction. And I just wanted to really thank you for the amazing opportunity to share thoughts and considerations about how I practice in architecture and in academia and as an Indigenous person from Australia. And the title of my talk tonight is, as Claire mentioned, or a Country Terror Refrain. And they are 4 words that structure the presentation in a way as a preface to case studies that I'd like to share with you that conclude the presentation for tonight. They're 4 words, and I'm going to go into them. And they have been ideas that I've been thinking about in recent times, and how the application of indigeneity and Western philosophical thought and architecture and environments and placemaking can result in something that's impactful and enact ways of thinking that can be communicated and shared with you. So I'm from the University of Sydney, and we have an acknowledgement of country, and that is a protocol as part of opening a conversation, opening a meeting, opening a lecture. And this is our official acknowledgement. And an acknowledgement is when you are not a traditional custodian of the place, and you are there paying your respects of being on that country. And the University of Sydney, recognises that for thousands of years that knowledge has been exchanged, and that there are benefits to that knowledge exchange that has been continuous and still continues and will continue into the future. And the campuses, they sit on many different lands and associated with many different waters. And these are tribal groups that have, with these interactions with Western colonial systems, are still present. We are celebrating our 175-year anniversary, so 1850. It's the first university in Australia, but it sits within a context of 65,000 years of knowledge, of sharing, of really, how that gets shared through the generations. So it sort of puts it into perspective about the time frames and that duration of time and the consideration of occupation on the Australian continent. And that goes for, the context of where we are now, and also recognise the traditional custodians of the country that we're on now, and how that is, and pay my respects to elders, past and present, and also to Indigenous community who are custodians of place in a sense, and pay respects to them as well. So really thankful that some of you are here, but also to the broader audience. It's fantastic to be able to share this presentation and to give you an idea of some of the thought processes that are happening in my mind as an Indigenous person in Australia interacting with Western environments. So tonight's presentation, it's presented in the context of a story tell. And the story tell is about my relationship to my culture, and in particular, the community that has surrounded me in my ways growing up as a person, identifying as Aboriginal, and then identifying as Kuku-Yalanji, identifying as part of an Aboriginal community that has close connections with each other. And I consider myself to be very fortunate in that regard. And there are members in the community who haven't been so fortunate in that way. But I wanted to talk to it in this context about relating it to these four words and some of the philosophical thinking that's behind it. And I will preface it by saying that my journey in a philosophical sense is ongoing, and with these words and the philosophical basis of them, I'm no expert by any means, but it's always important to reach out to concepts that are new or that are important in particular contexts and embrace them, or find ways that you can connect with them, or find that these connections relate to Indigenous cultures in many different ways. So I relate it to the storytell in relation to my grandparents. And the storytelling process is, in this case, I use this quote that was provided to me by a colleague, and says that storytelling must begin with the teller positioning him or herself in relation to clan and place. Before embarking on the storyteller must first describe their journey to the place where the story begins. Every one of us in this room, everywhere, has a story to tell. And the story is multifaceted, it's deeply cultural, and it's deeply connected to places. So these are my grandparents, and on the left is my grandmother, Mary, and on the right is my grandfather, Harry. And these are photographs that were taken around Australia as a way of documenting Aboriginal people in communities. And it was done by an anthropologist and linguist named Tyndale. And the story in relation to how I connect with my grandparents, I never knew my grandfather. He died before I was born. And my grandmother, I was 7 when she passed away. So there's very little memories of who they are. But the way that I connect with them are through these types of photographs. And these types of photographs are very powerful and connected with Aboriginal community members around Australia. And no doubt that there's similar types of photographs in other places with Indigenous populations who have been colonised. And these photographs, they sort of represent this sort of notion of living in an environment that is challenging and with many barriers, and having to be very resilient in order to find ways around those barriers. And instances of those barriers, they go all the way up to the bureaucratic level with quotes like this, where it says the native is very susceptible to all the physical and moral ills of our civilization, and it's only by complete separation of these two races that we can save him from hopeless contamination and eventual extinction, as well as safeguard the purity of our own blood. So that was a quote from the Chief Protector of Aboriginals in Queensland, and it's at a time when my grandparents were alive, and really recognising that it's quite inhumane and very desperately creates a barrier for the ways that people live in a society that was preventing the coming together, but ultimately really promoting separation. So their lives were part of the Aboriginal Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act, 1897. And it's an act that was designed to separate Aboriginal people in Queensland from the rest of the population. So it's a very discriminatory document, and something that was put forward as a way of, in inverted commas, protecting Aboriginal people from society, from the broader society, when in fact it's about that notion of separating and keeping them away and out of public sight. And this document was ultimately around for many years, and it wasn't until 1967 when Aboriginal people were ultimately included as part of the Australian population. So 1967 is when my sister was born, so it's in very close living memory to my situation and where I am at now in relation to my sister. This also relates to my mother and father and their story that sits underneath this umbrella act, and then for my grandparents as a way of really, at a bureaucratic level, controlling their lives. So when I talk about the word aura, the word is mentioned in the context of the work of Benjamin, and how it was really describing this notion about reproductions of works of art, and that capacity of how they, the aura of those objects or of those works of art dissipate with each reproduction. And it's only when you see the thing in real life and engage and interact with it at a personal level that the aura is present, the aura is at its most strongest. And when I sort of came across that, this notion, it's really provided an instance of how we connect or certainly take for granted the things that are right in front of us and are in plain sight as well. So in that respect, it's about the authenticity of that work of art, of that creative expression that, sort of transcends time and also creates a very deeply personal connection. And I thought there's some sort of interesting connections with architecture and place. You can look at as many photographs, website images, stories told in books, but it doesn't compare to being in the place itself or interacting and smelling, the environment or that multisensory aspect of it. So in that sense, the aura is that notion of being directly interacting with that creative expression, with that designed environment, and how that can be impactful on your ways. So this is an example from where I'm from, or the country of my ancestry. It's Western Yalanji country, and it's remote. And you arrive, there's a particular location where you arrive at this setting, and in the foreground is a plateau, and then it falls into a very deep ravine, and then it rises back up on the other side to plateau again into the distance. The important thing about that drop in the foreground over the precipice is that you can walk down a pathway and then arrive at this rock art gallery. And we were fortunate enough to be hosted to go into this space and see this rock art gallery and the paintings, the stories that it was communicating. And the thing about the space was that it was an overhang, and the stories communicated through the art expression was telling stories that were for generations to learn from, contribute to set up camp, to create fire and warmth, and to get a decent view over the ravine, and also provide protection. So it's this really interesting sort of dynamic of, it's hard to explain it in the image that you see on the screen, but when you arrive into those places, which I'm sure there's many in the vicinity of here, that it is something that's very special and impacts on your being, and how that can be something to take away and really have as a very strong memory to utilise in respectful ways, such as this presentation. And that, to me, is this notion of aura, and to replicate it in this sense through these images, and to be communicating the story to in this second-hand nature. It doesn't have the same impact, but there's certainly the message is that, to really take, to not take for granted how important it is to be in these places and to really take in the experience. And architecture, of course, and placemaking uses these types of concepts. Great places, impact on you. And there's tangible and intangible ways that it affects you, and it can be something that stays with you for many years, and also influences your practices. So as you move through the day, the time moves on, the daylighting changes, the sun sets, the feeling of being in that place and experiencing it is powerful and immense. And it's also immersive too. And you can, be out in these places and see these birds, kookaburras, and recognise that as something that's on country. But there's also, this is in Sydney, my local train station, and these two guys are just sitting there on the wire, taking in the experience. And certainly when I'm standing there and they arrive at the place, it becomes a very special interaction. That again, they just happen to be in the vicinity that where I am, and here's an opportunity to create something special or a memory. Likewise, Sydney's famous for its harbour, and it's also famous for the walks that are present at that interface between the land and the water, and how significant it is as a way of life that has always been present and will always be. And again, it's that notion of arriving into that place, or walking through these various thresholds, and then arriving at particular ones that you think are powerful, and a way to take away that experience. So it's the concept of aura and how that relates to this concept of country, which is an Australian, uses the word country. It's a notion that relates to land and water and sky and knowledge systems and histories and stories. And when I think of country, there's many different ways that you can define it. Well, there's probably never ever one way to, and it's always different, especially if you're, speaking it, and that reproduction quality of it means that it will never be the same when you do try to describe what it means. And this is an example definition that I think is really powerful. That was written by a collaborative research piece by a community in Arnhem Land in the north of Australia, Burrawanga. And there's a whole bunch of layers and aspects to what you can think about and consider, and what has been and continues to be important to that community who has written this and created it in a way to share it in this research that in itself provides a way for people to connect with it or relate to it. So for every aspect of this definition, there is something in there. All of these things are ways that you, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, can relate to these aspects. And it's very long. It's a very long definition. It just goes to show the sort of multifaceted nature of the considerations that are important at that time for that community, and the way that it has been documented in this written form. So it's something that I wanted to just share with you, and to unpack the sort of complex nature of it, but also the practices that relate to all these aspects have been developed over thousands of years, and the thinking and the philosophies behind it have been developed over thousands of years, and something that certainly can be appreciated in the context of a university that's been there for 175 years. So there's certainly just perspectives that are important to take in, and a way to sort of situate oneself to unpack that relational quality of these aspects of what this definition means to how it means to your own makeup. So in terms of country, this is the place, Cairns, where I was born and raised. And I am Kuku-Yalanji, which is north of Cairns. And Cairns is Gimuy, Wallabara, Yidinji country. So they are the people, the traditional custodians. And as you can see, it's a very flat landscape that on the left there you can see it's a mangrove system. It's an interstitial zone. Salt water meets the fresh. And on the right would have been similar landscape, but it's been filled in order to create a township, which is fairly strange to go through that sort of process, but it's not uncommon to change landscapes in this way in a Western sense. So that's in the foreground, and then it leads to this really beautiful mountain range that's in the background. And I was born and raised in there, and the story with my grandparents was that they moved to Cairns, or were permitted to move to Cairns from an Anglican mission called Yarrabah. And Yarrabah is to the left of the screen over this mountain range. So I'll show it in a slide in a moment, but it's a concept of out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. And with this small town, the Aboriginal people were not present. If they were permitted to be present, they were only permitted to be there at certain times of the days with curfews. And then if they wished to be permitted, if they were permitted to stay there permanently, then they would have to walk around with a passport-style document that was commonly known as a dog tag. in order to show proof that they had permission to be living in this place. So this is where I grew up, and around this place, alongside a lot of other regional centres in Australia, and no doubt across the world, colonised environments, there's a lot of neoclassical, colonial heritage architecture and place-making strategies that are part of that environment. And Cairns is no different, despite this pristine, environment that is present to go there and see the sunrise and really take in the beauty and the power of that part of the day. It also holds these types of built environments where these present as a way of demonstrating a Western way of building the environment and in a sense transplanting architectural forms from elsewhere to be on this very far away country. And this is an example of a Shire Council office this is all on the waterfront. This is another example that was a lands department building that was responsible for the management of land properties, and has now been transformed into an art gallery. And then around the other corner is a courthouse and a police station that was set up. So these are all in the same block, and what it means is that there's many other buildings of similar nature that line the street and other blocks around that vicinity. Is that for me, as someone growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, these were imposing buildings, or buildings that you thought didn't have a sense of belonging or could relate to them in any way. And that to me is quite, a way of the aura of those places then becomes negative to a section of the community, that perhaps there's ways that those environments could be designed differently in order to create a sense of belonging to this. So it's just, just thinking through what that would mean to people like my grandparents, in interacting with those types of built environments would take, I think, enormous strength in order to encounter those conditions and to, continue living and being part of a community. So no doubt there's also, when you approach buildings and forms, you can get there's also ways that you get a sense. And just being here, the really interesting thing about this place is that there's a style of architecture that to me presents quite a sense of not belonging. So, but then the way that it's been developed in more recent times and the addition and alternative ways of approaching into the space, creates an interesting dialogue with an existing building, with the histories that are part of it that have been detrimental to Indigenous communities, and how that, you can shift the dialogue or create the conversations that can create new dialogues. And it's ongoing, certainly, but those stories will always be part of this place. And no doubt when I share those buildings from Cairns, that I find the relations with a building such as this, but also to recognise that there's changes or an evolution of an original form that creates a point of difference moving forward into the future. So when I talk, that's the notion of aura and country together, this sort of living presence in all ecological systems and interconnected storylines, and how they're continually communicating with us, and that we carefully listen to and care for and connect with them as obligations. So it's a sort of easy to take for granted your movement through space, But certainly there's ways to unpack and consider and what that means in the context of Indigenous communities. The next item is a word called terror, and I was really interested in this word after visiting Berlin in 2023 for the first time. And in the context of this presentation, it sort of presents opportunities to look back into quotes such as this: were the wretched remnants of an ill-treated race to be treated as if they were worse than criminals? For that was what the committee was asked to do. Were those poor creatures who had been all but exterminated either by bullet or disease by the European to be treated in that way and deported from place to place at the sweet will of the government? So there's this thing about considering this impact, the impact of movement, or the impact of relocation, forced relocation, violent relocation, violent impact on communities. And I've been looking at this word, in relation to this visit, recent visit to Berlin in Germany, and relating it to the notion that was communicated by Arendt. Terror is not the same as violence, it's rather the form of government that comes into being when violence, having destroyed all power between people, doesn't abdicate, but on the contrary, remains in complete control. And in the context of post-World War II, Nuremberg trials, this word, was then, in more recent times, presented as the title of one of the museums in Berlin that was looking into that Nazi history of Germany, and it's the topography of terror, and that really did have an impact on my being, going into that place, seeing all these different exhibitions of information that at some point was very, very real, but we are now removed from it. But I think there's something about that word terror, that does cut through and does present a point of difference in the way that you engage with that place, or to think about what terror means and its etymology and its other words that are associated with it. And to recognise that this architecture is built on the site of former SS headquarters and Gestapo, and how, as a way of countering that narrative, to create a museum that is communicating the horrors or the terror of that regime. And I can really say that it has been very impactful on me, and to then relate that back to the original quote that I presented earlier about the forms of government, in relation to Arendt's quote, doesn't abdicate, but on the contrary remains in complete control. And in a colonial sense, or a coloniser sense, that is the system, and it's called a state. They create countries out of it, but ultimately there's a non process of abdication and complete, but also then complete control over the Indigenous peoples of these colonised places. And that sits within me. That's part of my story, and it's part of stories of people in the room here. And there's ways that we can appreciate and learn from those sorts of histories, or the lived histories that are still currently present, and how that can be, what are the moves that can, present as counter propositions. So again, this is something to think through. The daily lives of people like my grandparents is living through a regime of terror and trying to just live and trying to make the best of the opportunities that they have to give to their children. My father, as one example, to move forward. And that relates back to this notion of, again, of, I showed the aerial view of Cairns, pristine, about all this landscape around in that region was designed, as bureaucracy to design ways to get people get Aboriginal people off those lands so that they could be commodified, so that the land could be commodified. And as I mentioned before, in the previous image of the aerial shot of Cairns out of picture was this little settlement here. And that was an Anglican mission that was set up in the late 1800s. It's called Yarrabah, and it's a place where my grandparents were sent and, isolated with other community members also isolated and expected to live. And given little opportunities, but with the opportunities that they were given, that they're ways forward in order to create open doors for next generations. It's grateful, there's gratitude there to recognise that and how that can be something that we can all appreciate, or to recognise that despite the cultures that I come from, that there are cultures out there that also have presented and faced adversity and regimes of terror and have had to deal with that and find a way forward. Sometimes it didn't happen. I'm very fortunate. And these photographs, as I mentioned, they're all over Australia. There's families with these types of photographs that have documented their relations, their ancestors, in this very scientific way. And they sit under, the originals sit in a very well-guarded museum environment that requires many hoops to jump through in order to access. The refrain is is a more recent word that I've introduced into this presentation, and it's a word that's borrowed from Deleuze and Guattari and from Thousand Plateaus and work previous to that. But at a sort of surface level, my understandings of it, to me, it provides this really interesting way of thinking about the concepts of, what are the processes that enable us to move on or to continue moving, or how they create a space that is empowered to inform and influence ways forward. And a couple of quotes just in relation to it at a very high level. Refrains are signatures in the world, and the expression of such signatures entails the formation of a domain. And one of the key examples that they use is like a child humming a tune in the dark. Already performs a territorialising act. Humming is a retinalo, insofar as it expresses a safe zone or a kind of sonorous shelter, even if the child is the only one listening. So I just wanted to read something that I wrote down earlier in relation to how I can sort of articulate it a little bit further. It's mindful of the time. Refrains construct and deconstruct territories through music, behaviour, language, placemaking, architecture, from a molecular detail to the expansive forces of the cosmos. When you add all these things up, these expressions evolve existing situations into new creations. From the deeply personal to the collective communal, these expressions, rhythms, operate across scales, creating stability in chaos, always with potential for new possibilities. Placemaking and architecture can exemplify this collectivity of rhythms that builds on concepts of the refrain, the child humming the tune to oneself, in the dark to create safety, the interactive movement of the winds and waters. The relational songs that link plant behaviours in one place with food harvesting and hunting in another, developed over millennia. The gesture that undermines the colonial gaze, the architectural move that counters narratives of power and control, a relinquishment, a recalibration, however small, presents a new fragile stability, a stable fragility that's always evolving respectfully. And, you know, that's just a thought piece that is sort of all thoughts that run around crazy in my head, but certainly how you can put it into a form of expression to share with you tonight. Just wanted to present that. One of the other examples that was there present in Berlin was the Jewish Museum by Daniel Liebeskind. And again, this notion of being in this place with such deeply traumatic histories, to then place this important experience into the heart of this environment, you know, really provides something different. Really provides a different way of taking in the world. The lens of, you know, moving through the building and taking in the design moves with these corridor spaces, for instance, and the, you know, the sloping floors, and then into these spaces, the Holocaust Tower, Garden of Exile, and, you know, these, how they really do create this impactful multi-sensory experience. And as an architectural experience, you know, you get a sense of really being part of something that's quite special, and in a sense, you know, the aura of this place is strong when you are there personally to take in that experience. And it's where, you know, sort of then creating these environments that present to the viewer this really interesting way of interacting with history, the stories that are part of this place and these cultures, and how that relates to one's own cultural makeup. So that to me then unpacks this notion of storytelling and this notion of song lines, this sort of the repetition of information that becomes second nature, and that becomes handed down as a way to really clarify and articulate these deeply traumatic experiences. Again, you know, some other examples, you know, moving through Berlin with cobble replacements with these really powerful, you know, moments, and that to me it just provides again how it's a small contribution, a small interaction that requires attention, you know, to see it. But when you do see it, it's something that you'll never forget. In Australia, you know, there's been interventions that really do take in this notion of that interactive quality. And this is one example at the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, called In Absence by Johannes Scarce and Edition Office. This is another example at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. And this is a memorial called For Our Country. So it's for Australian Indigenous soldiers who served. And again, it's this notion of interacting directly with these institutions. In this case, you know, providing a mirror to that institution as a way of interacting quite powerfully. This is the Art Gallery of South Australia, and how that, you know, the formality of this forecourt and the entry into this space provides a pretty intense encounter that's built on histories that were detrimental to Aboriginal people, but also then, you know, interventions that can take place that reference very, very powerful and famous interventions, the Tent Embassy, which is in Canberra, and how that, as a ephemeral act, can provide a different narrative that can contribute to the way conversations continue to take place. The University of Sydney, modern infrastructure and the storytelling that can communicate and be present to the student gaze, the academic gaze, as they interact with it on a daily basis. The vastness of these types of spaces, once you encounter them and really take in the experiences, is definitely impactful. This is the Sydney Opera House on Benalong Point in the Sydney that interfaces with the harbour, and this is an artwork by Megan Cope called Whispers. And again, it's this notion of here is a direct reference to a storyline of place, of community, local community that interacted with this place, and the shell midden structures that are present up and down the Australian coast were celebrated in this work. In Redfern, again, these colonial structures, neoclassical structures that then transform into programmatically that then engages that building in a very different way. And at the Central Railway Station, which was a place of significance for Aboriginal people, especially for young Aboriginal children who were removed and sent to homes away from their families, and they utilised the New South Wales train system to take away these children, and this as a commemoration act, to create this encounter within that space provides a certain aura and presence. And then to come back to Daniel's, it's like, the different nature, the nature of approach and appreciation of the built form. You mitigate that as you move around it. With that new addition, you create this different type of approach into the space that's at the heart of the building, and to me provides a certain level of comfort that can be, that can make a difference to, being in the space. So those are some of the things that I wanted to communicate, and I'll probably spend a bit of time on that, which means that I wanted to just share with you some of those refrains of how some of the work that I've done in recent times. There's 3 case studies, 3 refrains I wanted to quickly talk to. This is one initiative that is part of the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning, where I work, and it is a initiative that's part of the strategic plan, and part of that plan was to develop an Indigenous research hub, and how we can really generate conversations, of which this week, and the conversations with Claire, that Claire's facilitated, certainly forms part of that remit. And it is this notion of, there's a lot of good things that are happening in the space, in the school, and how do we really, create this critical mass of information so that we can share what we do with the broader community. And at a very high level, it's about pulling together and celebrating and critiquing the work that we do in relation to Indigenous content in education, in research, in external engagement, and how we can build on that to create new innovations or new ways of thinking, new partnerships, new opportunities for our next generations. And it's about being dynamic and inclusive, and it's about a belonging, creating a place that's ours. There's a whole bunch of change that would be fantastic to continue to talk about and implement. These are big institutions. Sometimes things move slowly, but sometimes those slow qualities means that we can really do things well, or the conversations can be very, very in-depth in order to formulate the strategy that can work. All of these initiatives that we wanted to share with the broader community. How can that be something that we can invite others into as a way of just creating dialogue, creating exchange, and creating a community? And there's experiences that I have that I think are important to share, and certainly to really put forward at different scales, locally, nationally and internationally, give the student experience something that they'll always remember and always then become, are always informed about and can influence their practice in the future. Research that cuts through, that's impactful, that's with community. Engagement, and this type of engagement has certainly been refreshing, and one that I'm keen to make sure that we continue. A brief list of some of these items, and how we can move forward with it. One of these projects, research projects that's on at the moment, it's titled Indigenising the Built Environment in Australia. And it's one that looks at a very particular document called the National Standard of Competency for Architects. In Australia, there's competencies and performance criteria that architecture schools are required to meet. And in this iteration of this document, there were 8 performance criteria that specifically relate to First Nations content and cultures, and how that can be woven into the fabric of curriculum. And also for professional practice as well. So in professional practice, continuing professional development sense, that these topics are part of the ecology of architectural practice. And there has been quite a shift in more recent times about the engagement with the profession and broader built environment disciplines, with First Nations, cultural practices and communities and country, and how that can be something to really build on and celebrate, and always learn from and inform those next moves. So these are some of the ecosystem of what happens in Australia. There's 22 schools of architecture that observe, that have to meet these particular performance criteria, and how they interact, with students who graduate and then go out into practice and then register to become a registered architect. And there are these registration boards that exist for each state and territory around Australia. And there's different profiles and different competencies, and they're grouped together. And at a very high level, you're looking at these are the 8 performance criteria that relate specifically to First Nations. And at this point, how that is impactful for the students who are moving through the architecture program right now. There's a bit more detail about it. I won't go into it. It just goes to show you the level of consideration, but also the level of interconnectedness, between the different criteria, which in a sense to me really highlights that notion in a First Nations context of things don't sit in isolation, and topics and considerations don't sit in isolations, but they are always connecting with each other. We've done a large survey that has just really, as the start of a process, in order to gauge from universities and professional practice the nature of how they are interacting with these performance criteria. And there's various results and categories of information that we've been looking into that by and large, demonstrate that there is a strong, appreciation and need to understand and want to understand more about how, the best practice considerations in relation to culture and community and country as part of their architectural practice. There's very few Aboriginal architects in Australia, like here in Canada. It's a very underrepresented demographic, but there's certainly many instances from the survey that demonstrate the levels of discrimination and practices that again provide challenges for Indigenous practitioners, and how that how can we look to and learn from these responses, and think carefully about what are the next moves, what are the moves that can alleviate these issues. So in the context of designing and working in the context of First Nations cultures, there's barriers that still exist that impact on the way that these practices happen. So there's a whole bunch of things that are communicated. I won't dwell on them. I have one more case study to share, and then I'll wrap things up. But by and large, there is this very sort of strong appreciation and need to, want to understand more about how you can do things better. The last thing I wanted to share with you is a project that I was involved in this year at the Venice Architecture Biennale, and it's a project exhibition in the Australia Pavilion. It's called Home, and in the context of this presentation, I've used the term country as a creative process. And the exhibition is a biannual event, so architecture is 1 year, and then the art biennale is in every second year, and it switches between the two. This is the Australia Pavilion. It's a really interesting form. It's a black box, and it's designed by a Melbourne architect group famous for their boxes, called DCM, and they're really good people. And it's the most recent pavilion of the Biennale. Biennales or exhibitions of this sort, a lot of things were built in the first half of the 20th century, and then built forms like this are rare in that space. But it is a big box, which means that it then provides a space that is a very simple gallery space. It's run through the Australian Institute of Architects as the commissioning body. Creative Australia is the peak art Australian government agency, and La Biennale di Venezia is the Venice curator group. This is the project, and the overall concept of the vision home was about asking the question that is quite universal about what does home mean to you. What does home mean to you is something that a response can be provided, by anyone. And home can mean, celebration and happiness. It can also mean, trauma and challenges. And so it's really important to acknowledge that, and that can in turn inform the thinking about how you move into this space, how you interact with it, how you appreciate the sort of architectural qualities of it, and how you then leave it. This is the group that I was part of. There's 7 of us. We're all First Nations. It's a groundbreaking appointment that for the first time in the history of the Architecture Biennale. And it's just provided a very strong focus about how we could tell our story through the lens of home, and how it could then inform the way that we wanted it to interact for our guests who entered into the space to interact with it. Home for me is Cairns, this, as I showed in the image previously. It's also meant that I went over there for a couple of months, so I really appreciated the notion of home in a temporary sense, but also to recognise that there are these qualities of it that, again, you relate this place to what I consider what home is. And my kids there in the foreground, just being in these vast spaces that have these particular histories, and they're very much histories of place that resonates for me, and how that is impactful on being there in Venice, but also how that relates to my thinking about what home means to me. All these different experiences, to take away. That's the location of the Biennale in the red. These are some of the concepts that were important that I wanted to quickly show to you tonight. Just that movement, use of natural materials, the qualities of engagement that it was all about, multisensory interaction and stimulation, and really moving and encouraging people to sort of counter the Western notion of gallery experience, and where people can engage directly with the belongings that are in the space. You can pick them up, you can hold them, you can smell them, you can place them down carefully, like as if you were in someone else's home, and you are respectful and delicate and always caring. Some of the architectural concepts, that I wanted to quickly share with you, that notion of moving into the space. There's a threshold into this vestibule, and then there's this interesting encounter with this rammed earth wall that, again, it's about the texture and quality of that engagement as you move into it, and then you see around to the edges that there's also material qualities and sensations that can draw you around this initial encounter. The encounter also had this little gap in the middle that allowed you to get a sneak peek of what was behind the wall and how that could entice that movement. The next move was about recognising the view out the large window, which looks out over a canal, which is a very Venetian thing, and how that can be incorporated into the space. But also that notion of the land and water interface for culture is important. So recognising that is something of a consideration. Just circulating around the space, we created this space in the round in order for it to break down hierarchies, and that movement then anywhere along that circulation you could sit down on the rammed earth bench and pause and take in the experience. You could also divert and deviate off that path, off that circulation, and move into the central space. It's got a sand covering, so again it offers this sensory difference to the polished concrete floors around the outside, to being encouraged to take off your shoes and walk in the sand and sit down on the bench. And then finally, that bench, and moving around the space was all about respite and encouraging people to create dialogue with each other. Some images. These are things that we term the living belongings, and they are, to quickly wrap up this presentation, part of this engagement for the appointment, the idea was to reach out to the schools of architecture around Australia and say, we're doing the Venice Biennale, Architecture Biennale, we want students to be involved in this and to give them agency on this global stage as a way of really engaging them in this special experience. So we created we reached out to the universities, 11 universities collaborated, and we created a program that was designed to that was a making process. So it was about making in order to accompany that creation of dialogue with each other in these student groups from all around the country in their own spaces as a way of generating this relationship with First Nations cultures. And it was an amazing experience to really unpack the way that we can change, a pedagogical approach to architectural education. And this is my colleague Ali, who was instrumental in setting this up with me, and how it can do more than just operate, the schools operate separately in their own silos, but how can we bring schools together as a collective and, generate the relationship building between that student cohort and ourselves and the colleagues associated with these universities that can, create a new way of thinking about architectural education. So these are some of the works in progress. We had a strong social media campaign that the students jumped at to contribute to. And again, it's that sort of intergenerational thing of giving agency to students in order to celebrate their ways of thinking. And all of their ways of thinking is based on their own cultural backgrounds. There's many different stories that were told through these belongings. And in turn, that then provides, a stimulus for how that can inform the way that they think about and relate to architecture, and especially if they're working with Indigenous communities in their practices moving forward. So there's all these, amazing creations, creative expressions that were put forward, communicated with each other, and told in the first person about their stories, which is something of a methodology that is so important to me, and then how that feeds into the design process. This was the sort of the group of belongings that was exhibited, and 39 in total out of 117 that were sent over there, and yeah, they sit in the space really well. This was the basic question, how that can be just something that's impactful and resonates at a very foundational level, and what that means in the context of how that can drive your practices moving forward. So these are, there's some of the case studies. It sort of sits under this umbrella of this Indigenous knowledge place. Really want to create these connections. The conversations that we've had this week, I think, certainly create the start of something very special, and continuing that will be very important. Thanks very much. That concludes my presentation.
If there are questions from the audience, please speak up.
Thank you for that talk today. This has been really great. You spoke about sort of like the desire and progress of like the architecture discipline in Australia, pushing First Nations ideologies and like having these conversations in public and stuff like that. And I'm wondering, like, I think some of the graphs that you brought up showed like there's an intimate desire among students and practitioners to have these conversations. What do you think's next? Like after those conversations are had, how do you think that gets reflected in like the practice?
I think it's like unpacking the nuances of those results. And yeah, that's certainly the gold mine of how you analyse that information in order to feed that back into a system, designed to make things better ultimately. So yeah, I think that it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of time, and patience, I think, to continually arrive at resolutions that ultimately will evolve and change and, respond to external pressures, but also to, external opportunities as well. So yeah, at the moment things seem to be really sort of conducive to that change and evolution. I think even the architecture itself is, showing, in a sense, aesthetically, a sort of different approach to 5 years ago, or different look even. And yeah, the considerations behind those designs, while maybe less in depth, I think there's still barriers that prevent the depth happening, and those barriers, that's the advocacy that can happen, that can continually, break those barriers down.
Thanks again for your talk. That was very interesting and sort of gave a lot of food for thought. I'm just wondering, with your work in sort of creating these dialogues and recognizing the sort of importance of, or the prominence rather of sort of the global capitalist systems that we all work within, has there been any sort of outreach to the people in those sectors to see if they are able and willing to engage as well in these dialogues, or whether they're sort of left to the side and we sort of have an internal dialogue amongst the profession?
Yeah, I think it's a built environment, so the reach is out to, so yeah, those the bureaucracies and project managers, yeah, they're certainly on the list. And it's that engagement piece, when you put forward a research of this type, the buy-in or the interest levels are important to stimulate. That's one iteration of the survey, and there'll be another one that's the same to obtain a new sample group. But again, it's about reaching a diverse, group of professionals. I think we can't solve this, or architects can't do all the heavy lifting. We think we can, but it's got to be a collective effort. And there's small changes that happen in those bureaucracy spaces, and that are positive, and then you take 2 steps backwards, and it's always a negotiation that's happening, and that's sort of across the board in terms of working in this space. So yeah, the more diversity and who participate in this, that means then it becomes a collective effort rather than one group trying to solve all the problems.
Hello. So I've sat in rooms with well-meaning people, and we say, okay, we're going to talk about indigenizing curriculum. And then we speak about what we mean by indigenizing curriculum, and nobody has an agreement on what that means to them. I'm just curious, what does it mean to you?
I think the approach that I've taken is that it's the relationship. And then the hardest thing is pulling people into a seminar room and sitting at a table and trying to think in a makeshift in a group environment and try to thrash out a resolution on something. I think one thing that I've implemented in the school is just doing yarning circles. And there's a different sense of formality to it about raising issues that are important in an Indigenous context, but then to weave in how that relates to the thinking that the Dean is engaging in, and other executive members that are the decision makers. And it is that thing, you're sort of doing business, but they don't actually know that. Or you're planting the seeds and in a way that Inception style, where then it's like that's the idea is for them to pick up on and then think about its significance. And there's just opportunities as well, like the referendum for the recognition in the Constitution and the voice to Parliament in 2023. It was overwhelmingly defeated by the Australian population. But in our school, it was 99% support of staff. And that is, at a local level, we think that's something that's positive that comes out of it, that we have these pockets. that want to do good things. So you build on that, and yeah, build on the relationships that are important in order to create those. The resolutions are more iterative rather than confrontational, and you're just trying to sort out the basic logistics in order to move forward, rather than bringing everyone into the circle and giving everyone agency.
Michael, thank you so much. We'll continue the conversation. Indigenizing the curriculum is not about offering an Indigenous studio. It's about changing the way people think about culture and about relationships, I think. Looking forward to talking to you further about this, and thank you all for coming.